Good morning. Thank you for coming back. I love it. We have another really full, rich program today. A lot of excellent discussions. We saw Michael close us out last night, and he is a gem. He's going to kick us off on day 2 after I review a couple of things. So, first, I see only one snapshot story on the wall over here, and I know everyone is doing tremendous work in your area. So there's plenty of colored cards on the tables. We want to learn about your story. This is how we exchange great ideas. This is how we build the repository on our website, and we can do really colorful fact sheets. Yes. Oh, you know where to put it. Central, oh, we put Central Coast. It was just supposed to say North, Central, and South. I'm gonna cross that off. I'm gonna get a Sharpie. And also, it doesn't really matter. I thought there was gonna be an influx of snapshot stories, so we needed 3 poster papers. So I was just trying to split them up. Doesn't matter where it goes. There's tape on the table. We can stick it up there, but if you have something to share, please let us know. I am happy to see some contributions to the next big thing. Mike has been keeping an eye on that, and he's going to do a recap for us at the end of today, but still plenty of time to put your ideas up there. Sarah has an excellent next big thing. It involves a small film production crew and a talent show. Ask her about it during break. Some folks, actually multiple folks, have asked if the PowerPoint presentation shared over the course of 2 days will be available. I need to check in with all the presenters just to make sure they're comfortable with us distributing them. So give me a little time to do that. I want to make sure I hear from every single person and get their permission, and then I can follow up with the folks who agree to share the PowerPoint presentations. But we are also, I know that you've noticed, recording the sessions, and we'll splice them by session and process them and put them up on the floodmar.org website, but that takes us several months to do. So I know that there's a lot of really great material that's been shared, and you don't want to wait a few months. So that is on my follow-up to-do list. Yesterday, we had a friend from Sustainable Conservation snapping some professional pics with a very lovely camera, Cheyenne. He cannot be here today, but I think there's another person from Sustainable Conservation who might be, oh yeah, great. Oh, okay, so you got more pictures coming from Sustainable Conservation. If you don't want to be included in any of the pictures, no problem, let us know. We'll make sure that you're not included. But we also have folks who are hoping that we can share some of those pictures for other social media and blog posts and Floodmar websites too. So we'll do a little follow-up with that as well. And I did connect with someone from Sacramento State yesterday. Is Maureen here? Oh, Maureen, there you are. They do green infrastructure right around the corner here, and Maureen's willing to give a tour. So if anybody wants a tour of the green infrastructure during break or lunch or after the program, connect with Maureen in the purple top? Purple? Okay, great. I was going to call it mauve, but I don't think it qualifies as mauve. Okay. Great. And if anybody needs more motivational pieces of chocolate, let me know. I have some at my table. And Michael, you are up.
Morning, everyone. I'm your hype guy for today. Yesterday was incredible. We saw a lot. It was a whirlwind. I think all of our heads were spinning by the last talk. So I'm going to try and really quickly go through what we saw and then where we're going today, what we want to see from it. And then I'm going to ask the group what they want to see today, so be ready for the microphone to be passed around. So we kicked it off with the Floodmar network story yesterday. I think it's really important to think about how we set up the network, or not we, I wasn't involved, but it was set up in a really democratic way, which is awesome because everyone has the ability to contribute their voice, but it also requires some work. You have to show up to meetings and kind of participate, even if it's not your direct area. And then we went to our influencers, and our fantastic influencers that are kind of moving on to a new phase. And we need a lot of new people that are gonna kind of take that next step and be the change they wanna see, right? Because we need to fill that void that's gonna be left as they kind of are less involved in the network. We need people to step up. The influencers have done a lot. There's still plenty of challenges left over. They haven't solved all our problems yet, so A lot of good things to work on. We talked a little bit about the trailblazers, people who have found success at implementing flood MAR at different scales. I think one thing we saw that was interesting is, places that have struggled with water for a really long time, like Orange County, they've found solutions, they've found land, they've worked through these. Really hard problems take time, and they've kind of figured out solutions that are very local and specific to them. And then places that are kind of, trying to figure out what to do when there's not enough water, maybe Madera County or somewhere, there's not as much of a process in place to implement the same solutions. They don't just own all of the land, they don't own all the water rights, and finding solutions that work for those areas is going to be challenging. It's something we need to work on. And then we talked about the state of the state. A lot of the policy, Sigma, Paul Gosselin, Stephen Springhorn, David Fairman gave great talks. And I think what we've kind of seen that can be frustrating is that sometimes the trailblazers are a little bit ahead of the policy. So some people are getting great things done and the policy is lagging behind. But I think we need to think about what we're trying to change and like the scale of the system we're working on. It's really hard, and having a policy that works for all the different geographies and complexities in California, that's a huge challenge and something that's going to take continuous effort. So we can't be just too frustrated that, sometimes it's good to get permits and do things. We need to be patient and understand the magnitude of the challenges we're facing. And then we talked about technical tools. Really cool new ways. We have ability to look at the subsurface, understand things, incredible things we could do that we never could before. And I think that makes it could be hard that we can build these crazy models and understand these systems in such a weird, incredible way. But the policy isn't quite there that we can actually put the water in the ground. And that's going to take a lot of collaboration between our networks to kind of change that water that's available on paper to water that can actually get into the ground. And that's kind of what we're trying to work through, I think. And then plans to progress. I think everyone was sleepy at that point. But there was a really good panel. Tim Godwin was narrating, and we had, I think, a lot of the examples that when we come back in several years, we're going to be saying those are kind of our trailblazers that we're leading the way and kind of finding new areas to work flood MAR into our systems. So that brings us to day 2. We're going to kick it off with the intersection of recharge and water quality. That's something we've been trying to talk more about for a long time, so that's really exciting. Then we have harnessing extremes. We have Mike Anderson here, and then we also have Mike Mearswa, Mark Strudley. I did not get the invite to the panel, despite being a Michael, but yeah, I'm not sure what's up. Oh, and Christine as well from GEI, talking about kind of how we can take advantage of flood systems and work that into flood MAR, put the flood in flood MAR, right? Really important. And then another thing that I think the network has really been pushing in the last couple of years is how do we think about nature, natural flows, right? There's a limited amount of water, and how we distribute it affects everything. So are we looking at what we're pulling off the river in an equitable and fair way? A lot of people have done incredible work here. Watershed studies will kind of take a look at a system at scale and see kind of the changes of, if we apply flood MAR at scale, what happens to all these systems? How does that affect the environment? And we will have several other talks kind of looking at the ecological outcomes of that. And then the last thing, unlocking incentives. I believe they're going to tell us where all the money is. So it will solve all of our problems. So with that, I guess I will see if anyone has anything they want to share for what they want to see today, something they want to have the discussion about, who they want to talk to.
Or a reflection about yesterday. That's another option. I got the microphone. I can take it to a raised hand. Who's looking for more mics? Okay. Power for the Michaels. Yeah. Maybe we should do an all mic photo later. Who's looking forward to something specific today? Who wasn't here yesterday? Any hands? Just a few? Just one? Just two? Okay. Welcome. Congratulations for joining us on day 2. Yesterday was awesome. Today will be awesome too.
while we're getting settled in, one more big thank you to the farm planning team. I accidentally left off Laura from this list yesterday, and I felt like a horrible person. Laura's done so much for us, and she's a co-lead for our action teams. You're going to hear from her again today. So huge thank you to our planning team and our sponsors. All right, you ready, Peter? That's not Peter. Here we go.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming back for this second day. My name is Peter Nico. I'm at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, where I'm the director of what we call our Energy Geosciences Division that houses our groundwater quality and all of our groundwater work. And we're here today to talk about, well, groundwater quality. I think it's fair to say in the past day and in the past years, the majority of the discussion about floodmar has been about quantity, which is fair enough. There's no point in talking about the quality of water you don't have. But conversely, there's no point in having water that you can't use because of the quality of it. So today we're going to talk a little bit about quality, which I think we all know is an important part of this. But we all know that it's complex. You take all of the hydrologic, structural complexity we saw yesterday with some of the new models, and you lay on top of that the chemical complexity of the system, and it gets really complicated. So quality is scientifically complicated, it's legally complicated, it's socially and politically complicated, but it's really important. So we're going to take the next hour and see if we can sort all of that out. So the people who are going to do that, just going to introduce our panel, is Kija Rivers, who's a senior policy advocate at the Community Water Center and works on nitrate regulation such that all Californians can have clean and safe drinking water. Emily Haugen, who's an engineering geologist from the Division of Water Quality for the State Board, working largely with the GAMA program. Sarah Rueter, who has really been doing heavy labor coordinating Sustainable Conservation's water quality TAC and is a hydrologist working at Sustainable Conservation. And then the fourth panel member should have been Scott Bradford of the USDA, but he can't be here because of federal employee furloughs because of the shutdown. So for this morning's performance, I will play the role of Scott Bradford and do my best to present his slides. So with that, I will stop and I will just hand it over to Kija.
Hi everyone, good morning. My name is Kija Rivers. I'm a senior policy advocate at Community Water Center. Like Peter said, at Community Water Center, I mostly work on nitrate regulations like CV salts and the Irrigated Lands Program to ensure that all Californians have access to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water. And I'm really looking forward to sharing some of community's priorities. Thank you. And I'm really looking forward to sharing some of community's priorities when it comes to recharge and water quality. As we heard yesterday and continue to use recharge more and more as a tool to reach groundwater sustainability. All right. So since 2006, Community Water Center has been building a movement for water justice under the leadership and co-founder, under the leadership and executive director, Susana Dayanda, in order to drive community-driven solutions alongside directly impacted communities in order to have safe, clean, and affordable drinking water for all. And in 2012, Community Water Center helped pass the Human Right to Water, which ensures that all Californians have access to safe, clean, and affordable water. We're still working to actualize the human right to water for many communities, especially in the Central Valley and on the Central Coast, especially for these communities that depend on groundwater as their only source for drinking water. And recharge is really key to reach groundwater sustainability and also to ensure access to safe drinking water. However, we do need to recharge with community priorities at the forefront. So in 2024, the state established standards for how we can begin conducting managed aquifer recharge. And under this law, it required that the state conduct an analysis regarding where groundwater recharge will be effective and also protective of drinking water, consistent with the human right to water, and that also required the state to also conduct mapping to identify areas where recharge is unlikely to degrade groundwater quality based off of some considerations, such as the quality of source water, soil quality, and also the proximity to domestic wells. And as we heard yesterday, there is a lot of really great work going on by the state and by NGOs to better understand how we can recharge. And also looking at water quality, looking at how recharge can negatively and positively impact water quality. We heard a little bit about the State Water Board's Natural Recharge and Water Quality Tool, which Emily is going to share more about today, and Sustainable Conservation's Recharge and Water Quality White Paper that they're working on, and also Department of Water Resources Water Quality Monitoring Pilot Project that they'll begin. And as the state and NGOs continue to better understand how recharge can impact water quality and create all different kinds of guidance, agencies and organizations should continue to prioritize drinking water impacts and drinking water needs. So Community Water Center works with many groundwater dependent communities. These communities are often severely disadvantaged and experience drinking water scarcity, often caused by a steady increase of contaminants and dropping groundwater levels. So community partners and communities like Seville, Allensworth, and Poplar have been fighting for safe drinking water and sustainable access to drinking water for years, and water quality continues to be a priority for them. So I wanted to focus our attention on water quality contaminants in the Central Valley and on the Central Coast. Because of the prevalence of dairies and irrigated agriculture, there's a lot of nitrate contamination in these regions. And I have pictured here Community Water Center's drinking water tool, which shows us how communities in California are vulnerable to groundwater challenges affecting their access to long-term sustainable drinking water. And using the drinking water tool, we can just see how prevalent nitrate contamination is in these regions and in these communities, requiring many communities to rely on bottled water and treatment systems in order to safely manage their contaminated drinking water. So because of that, I recommend prioritizing the precautionary principle when conducting recharge in order to really protect water quality, especially because we know that drinking water is already so strained by dropping groundwater levels and increasing contaminants. And the work that the state and organizations are working on can help agencies and entities who are planning to conduct recharge better understand water quality impacts and how they can be avoided or mitigated. And some work has already been done to improve recharge and water quality protections back in 2023 and 2024. However, more analysis is being done and can be done to better understand how we can protect communities' drinking water when conducting recharge. In 2023, the governor passed executive order in 423, and that was later codified into law through SB 122. And these policies allowed for the diversion of flood flows in order to prevent imminent flood impacts and also to redirect this water flow for recharge percolation. However, the executive order specifically potentially allowed for contaminants to be further mobilized into groundwater because it was kind of a divert first and report later type of strategy. And then in 2024, in SB 122, additional protections were added to prevent some recharge-related water quality impacts, such as it prevented flood flow diversions to any agricultural field identified as an outlier under either by the State Water Board, the Regional Board, or the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. And it also prevented flood flows to dairies as well. And even with these restrictions, it was a similar report or divert first, report later type of strategy. Because yes, conducting recharge on cropland, which has been heavily, where nitrate fertilizers have been heavily applied, and dairies should be avoided. There is also more information about where we should and shouldn't be recharging in order to support drinking water needs. So communities prioritize having sustainable access to drinking water, meaning that residents need good water quality and also adequate water quantity for their daily needs. And to support these drinking water needs, certain elements can be considered as further recharge and water quality guidance is being developed, and also as groundwater recharge projects are being planned and implemented as well. For example, many of the elements in SB 659, such as mapping, can be further developed to understand where recharge projects can be best situated to support drinking water needs. For example, mapping can be done to understand what sites pose a risk to drinking water. As you know, dairies and irrigated ag are major sources of groundwater contamination. However, there are additional risks that can make communities' drinking water vulnerable to additional contamination. Agencies and organizations can also bolster water quality monitoring, especially near recharge sites and communities. And it's really important that this water quality monitoring is consistent in order to understand the baseline groundwater quality and understand how recharge projects might be altering it. And then lastly, guidance could also focus on long-term protection of our groundwater resources through sustainable nutrient management, which should be implemented before, during, and after recharge projects in order to prevent excessive amounts of nitrate that's existing in the soil and having that mobilized into the groundwater through recharge projects. And then here I have highlighted a couple of documents that Community Water Center put together alongside partners, community partners, and organizational partners. The first one is the Managed Aquifer Recharge Policy Recommendations, which highlights a lot of the practices that I mentioned today. And then also our well mitigation template, which also goes hand in hand with recharge in case communities' drinking water is impacted by water quality impacts. So thank you so much for your time today, and I'm looking forward to the panel.
So thank you very much, Kaya. Yeah, our next presenter is Emily.
So good morning. My name is Emily Haugen, and I'm an engineering geologist with the State Water Board in the Groundwater Ambient Monitoring and Assessment Unit, known as GAMA. My presentation is going to be a slightly different topic from what you've heard so far. Instead of focusing on flood-mar-related recharge specifically, I've been looking into precipitation or natural recharge across the state. So we started investigating recharge-related groundwater quality changes after the extreme weather events of early 2023 when we had 9 back-to-back atmospheric rivers that dropped around an average of 11 inches of precipitation statewide, and in some places more than 50 inches. This, of course, resulted in a lot of localized flooding. With so much water on the ground, especially in areas that are not ideal for surface recharge, such as nutrient-heavy dairy lands, the question arose of how is groundwater quality being affected? To answer this question, we need to know what the groundwater quality was before, during, and after the event. We also need to know how much precipitation fell to correlate the timing with groundwater quality. So we developed a tool called the Aquifer Recharge and Groundwater Quality Dashboard that allows a user to compare groundwater quality with local precipitation records or with groundwater levels. The groundwater quality data came from the GAMA Groundwater Information System and included only those wells with 8 or more analyses for a single constituent, with the most recent analyses being from 2024 to 2025. So this means that if you have a well with 5 analyses of nitrate, those nitrate analyses would not appear on the tool. The precipitation data came from the California Data Exchange Center using local weather stations, and the groundwater level information came from 3 sources: the Department of Water Resources Data Library, the GeoTracker Depth Water Measurements, and the U.S. Geological Survey National Water Information System. After all of the filtering, we ended up with about 35,000 wells and about 300 constituents. But it's important to note that not every well has 300 constituents. Some wells can only have one constituent, whereas some could have multiple. So this is a screenshot from the dashboard tool. The map on the right is populated with wells depicted as dots. In this case, the orange dots are wells with arsenic data from the last 5 years. At the top of the screen, you can select from a drop-down boxes the constituent of interest, the time frame, well category, and top of screen interval. Once a well is selected, 2 graphs will populate that you can see on the right-hand side. The graph on top is the local precipitation record, and the graph on the bottom is the concentration record of the chosen constituent. So I selected 3 wells using the dashboard tool to correlate precipitation events and constituent concentrations for nitrate and arsenic. I specifically chose wells with an overabundance of analyses. I think I set the filtering to something like 30 analyses over the last 5 years. So that way we could get a really clear pattern and have it reflected against the precipitation records. The blue rectangle is the wet season for the 2023 water year, so that corresponds to October through April. And that's when we are looking to see if there's a pattern that reflects groundwater quality changes with that extreme precipitation. This first well example is from Kern County, just west of Bakersfield. It's a relatively deep well with a screen length of 591 feet to 1,440 feet. This is a public supply well, and the land use immediately surrounding this well is urban. So if we look at the pattern of nitrate, it starts relatively high and drops down to almost 0. Well, goes from about 4 down to 0. Sorry, it's kind of small to see. So basically, we're showing here that the nitrate is decreasing during this heavy precipitation period. But almost immediately following this heavy precipitation period, the nitrate increases again. For arsenic, it appears to be the exact opposite. So arsenic concentrations increase, and this is a fairly high arsenic well, so it appears to increase from about 12 to 30, and that's micrograms per liter. And then after that, the arsenic concentrations appear to immediately decrease. And if you consider the wet periods over the last several years, we can see that the pattern seems to roughly stay consistent. This second well is also a public supply well. It's from Kings County near the town of Corcoran. It has a shallower screen depth of 217 to 467 feet, and the land use type is agricultural. The nitrate concentration in this well appears to increase overall. Yes, there are a few low concentrations, but just in general, the trend is increasing during the wet period, while arsenic in the same vein is decreasing overall during that wet period. And almost immediately following the wet period, the patterns flip yet again. And you can see that the overall patterns of the nitrate and the arsenic concentrations seem to mirror each other, so they have the opposite effect. Of particular note is that there does not appear to be a clear pattern during the wet season of other years, which indicates that something else may be controlling these concentrations than something as simple as just recharge. And just to point this out, this is the opposite pattern that we see from the last well. So nitrate's increasing instead of decreasing, and arsenic is decreasing instead of increasing. This last well example is from Orange County near an airport in Chino Hills. It's also a public supply well. However, we don't know what the depth is for the screened interval. The land use appears to be a mixture of ag and urban. However, it is near an airport, so it's probably more affected by the airport. There's a striking overall trend of decreasing nitrate and increasing arsenic over the selected time period, and that trend is a very strong pattern, so it's hard to see if there is any sort of recharge related influence. However, if you really squint your eyes and you look at it, it appears that the nitrate continues to decrease during this wet period, or alternatively, you could say because it flattens out, it's actually increasing. So this is a situation where it's really up to your own interpretation of the patterns that are occurring. So again, this is a different pattern from what we see of the other two wells. So all three examples shown had different patterns for nitrate and arsenic, which means that there are more factors at play than simple recharge. For example, some of the factors that matter are depth to groundwater, which includes both the vadose zone, which can allow for attenuation or capture of constituents from recharged water if it is large enough, and screen length, where the longer length allows for a more dilute sample from a thicker portion of the aquifer, which could drastically affect the concentrations. Subsurface materials matter because the geogenic constituents can be introduced when recharged water changes the groundwater chemistry. Sampling frequency should be increased to multiple times a year in order to catch the full pattern without a seasonal bias. So if we're not sampling enough, then we're not going to see a pattern. Land use matters because it could introduce constituents such as nitrate or pesticides or other organic constituents. Pre-existing concentrations are also important to know and to call out, because if you are starting with low concentrations, then any change in the concentration of that constituent could be dramatic, and you could think that, oh, this is really important, when in reality it's a change of, a 0.2 or something. Surface contamination needs to be taken into consideration, such as land surface application of nitrates or pesticides, waste spills, landfills, etc. And there's many more factors that I am not listing here that are probably also important for the groundwater quality. All of this to say is that recharge studies are going to be locally dependent. There's no one size fits all for these projects, and each needs to be treated separately. Part of any recharge project should be an understanding of the existing groundwater quality and the quality of the water that you are recharging, which means that groundwater quality monitoring is indispensable prior to any planned recharge event to develop a baseline to compare water quality to during and after the recharge project. It's also necessary to ensure that that data that's being entered into accessible public databases so that others may use that data for their own understanding. So even if a project is not necessarily recharge focused, but they are collecting groundwater data, if that data is entered into a public database, then people who want to do a recharge project could eventually access it and utilize it for their purposes. By being publicly accessible, it also means that it can be stored in GAMA GIS with other major groundwater quality data sets, so it's all hosted in one place and easily accessible. The GAMA unit is currently in development or pre-development of a tool showing the location of recharge projects. This has been a need that we've come up against for the last several years. While we know that recharge is occurring in many ways across the state, we just don't actually know where it's occurring, when it's occurred, how much volume of recharge water has been added. And so in order to create this map, we're gonna have to rely on voluntary information from you all and from other agencies to find out where these recharge projects are occurring. So thank you all for your time. My contact details are on the screen if you'd like to reach out.
Thank you, Emily, and I will give Scott's talk as soon as we. That's nice. There we go. Okay, thank you. I'm just waiting around. Okay, so a lot of what Scott prepared will really start to build onto some of the complexities that Emily laid out in her last slide. Some of the things we really need to consider for trying to understand and really get to a predictive understanding of how recharge is going to change water quality. So here's just two charts from a recent study looking at some technical problems potentially associated with different kinds of recharge in injection well and surface infiltration. The bars are coded roughly by topic. The bars in green are water quality related things. So there's two things to to call your attention to here. One, you see that a good number of those highest importance bars are green. So the water quality technical problems are real in multiple ways of recharge. And that you'll see that the water quality things that show up, like nutrients, like metals, like organic chemicals, are fairly common to two different or multiple different types of recharge. So we've got a recurring theme of the types of water quality things that we might need to be considered. When you think about what really drives the ultimate groundwater quality impact, if that's number 5 on this graph, you have to work your way through several steps. First of all, you have to think about what is the water quality, what is the chemistry of the source water that you're starting with. You have to think about the way you're recharging, the kind of recharging technique that you're using. You then have to think about how that couples with the structure and chemistry of the subsurface into which that water is going. And then you have to couple that with what is the current existing water quality of the groundwater to which that recharge water ultimately comes to. All of those things together is what's really going to determine the integrated impact of the recharge project on the groundwater quality. So if you think about potential contaminants to consider in the source water, here's just on the graph, there's just not quite pie chart, sort of pie chart of the different types of water that can be used in different types of recharge. But common to all of those source waters, you can have a lot of different things in the water that you could potentially be concerned about. You can have nutrients from whatever sources. You can have pathogens that you want to be concerned about. You could have pharmaceuticals and personal care products. Increasingly, concerns about PFAS are very important. And then you can just have particulates of various sorts, all of which couple with how your source water is going to interact with your existing subsurface. As far as treatment or how you use the water, but how you deal with the water before you use it, there's different types of technologies, as we all know, or approaches for getting the water, into the surface. If you're thinking about aquifer recharge, so pumped aquifer recharge, you have to treat that water before it goes into the ground, which can remove a lot of contaminants, but also it changes the chemistry of the water, which can then change the coupling with the chemistry of the existing groundwater. If you're thinking about, you can put things in through dry wells and trenches, and you have to think about just the chemistry and the conditions of the vadose zone. Or if you're doing land surface type infiltration, based surface spreading, flood mar that we're talking about here, you've got the all surface run of the surface that you have to consider in terms of coupling to your water quality. So things you can think about that come out with the subsurface part, not just what's in the water, but when you get into the root zone, you can have legacy salts, nutrients, agricultural chemicals, PFAS, nano and microplastics. You can have a lot of things that are historically built up into that root zone. If you go deeper into the subsurface, the likelihood of your important constituents probably changes significantly, and then you're thinking more about these geogenic sources, the iron, manganese, arsenic, chromium, uranium, things that exist naturally in the sediments, but as the chemistry of the water changes, they can be more or less prevalent in the water as you move it around. So you could think about in situ treatment. If stuff is coming in through the water, if it is being mobilized, it still has to travel through the system before it gets to a receptor well, to a drinking water well, or so on. Things can change in that process. You can have absorption or desorption of the contaminants of interest. They can degrade, they can change chemistry, and a lot of things depend, a lot of aspects of how you recharge impact those processes. The idea of how fast you recharge, the recharge rate, it impacts the contaminant storage, it impacts how fast the water goes into the ground, the amount of water already stored in the ground. And then really this idea, in which the graph on the right shows, is really the idea of residence time in the system between the recharge place and the receptor well, the place where you're interested in taking it out of the ground. So one simple important thing to think about is just having recharge projects, set back from receptor wells of interest to give space between whatever impact you might have to the receptor well. Of course, that is the opposite of what you want if you're hoping for a groundwater quality improvement. So things that recharge can do to the biogeochemistry of the system. As you saturate the system, you change the velocity that the water moves through the system. Saturated systems move water faster than unsaturated system. You're changing the area of the subsurface that is wetted or not wetted, and you're changing the different kinds of flow regimes through the system that you can have by putting more water into the system. You're also potentially changing the chemistry of that water, the ionic strength, which is really the total amount of stuff dissolved in it, but that drives different absorption, desorption properties of important things. You're changing the pH of the system, which again drives changes in chemical reaction rates and absorption, desorption. And you're changing the redox conditions, meaning how much oxygen is around and chemical transformations of species of interest, which can affect their mobility. If you think about the transport and fate and transport processes that you're talking about, I mentioned them a little bit already, but you have things that can detach or attach to the sediment and become mobile or not mobile in the water. You have solid phases that can be either dissolving or precipitating, like iron or manganese phases. You have, especially organic materials, they can be degrading quickly or less quickly, depending on the redox conditions. And all of these reactions are controlled by the things above. And then also you still have an additional role of colloids that can transport things in different ways, depending on how you're changing the system. So some things to really consider about different ways of monitoring. One, this idea that you have sensors, sort of direct sensors near wells, that sensors have the advantages of you can get very high quality data, you can use those to calibrate models. They have limitations in the sense that you really have point information as opposed to large scale information. You can only monitor them at so many points. It's time consuming to really instrument projects, and it's expensive, and it still leaves gaps. But it seems very important that we continue to gather this kind of data from MAR projects so that we build our understanding of how these systems really do affect the water quality. Alternatively, there are more distributed methods, like we heard about yesterday, the geophysical methods, the various TEMS or ERT, that can really help fill the gaps between locations, but they're not inherently chemically sensitive. But between the two, you can couple them and hopefully drive some understanding of your system. There's definitely a role for groundwater quality models. They have the advantage that they can be continuous in space. They can fill gaps between projects. They can be predictive. They can explicitly represent controlling processes. They can let you do scenarios ahead of time and future situations, and then therefore they can couple with management decisions. That said, they're only as good as the assumptions that go into them. They're only as good as our understanding of the heterogeneity of the system and our understanding of the parameters that drive those models. So Sarah will talk about this in just a minute, but really the TAC, Sustainable Conservation TAC, has been really trying to develop a guidance document to really have some practical ideas for optimal locations for MAR, for things that could be helpful to measure in terms of the source water, the soil, the sediment, and some ideas about really, to our best of our understanding at the moment, best practices for avoiding groundwater contamination associated with recharge activities. So with that, I will hand it to Sarah to bring us home.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Rueter, and I'm a hydrologist at Sustainable Conservation. And over the last year and a half, I've had the privilege of working with a technical advisory committee that was convened by Sustainable Conservation with the help of and support of the Department of Water Resources. And the goal of the technical advisory committee was to find a way to integrate groundwater quality considerations into the planning of managed aquifer recharge through replenishment planning, MARR. So a little bit of project background. This technical advisory committee got together and we met 5 different times, and had a lot of individual and small group meetings as well. It included state, federal, and local agency staff and members of NGOs, academics, members of irrigation districts, farmers. We had a very wide, a lot of different expertise in the room, but all related to manage aquifer recharge. And the goal was to develop a geospatial guide to guide the siting of MAR operations. So to achieve this goal, we first identified the factors that influence water quality outcomes that Peter talked about quite a bit. And we set out to summarize the recent research on these factors and how it relates to managed aquifer recharge, and catalog the data layers available in California to represent the factors spatially, and then outline the development of a decision support tool. So these are the key factors that we settle on. So the presence of contaminants, the proximity to sensitive receptors, current groundwater quality, the quality of the water you're applying, the hydrologic setting, including the climate and background recharge rates. And then there's the type of MAR event that you're running and the timing, frequency, duration, and method that you're using, and those are all things that you can control and that can't be mapped geospatially. So one type of MAR event operation at the same site might produce a different impact than another type of event. So if you had reverse tile drains versus injection wells or something like that. And we decided to focus on these contaminants because they're widespread in California. The first 3, arsenic, uranium, and chromium, are largely from natural sources and are called geogenic contamination when they end up in groundwater. And the rest are from anthropogenic activities, including animal and agriculture and other agriculture. And yeah, PFAS is everywhere. And all the different members contributed expertise about different data sources that we could use. And while we were discussing all the data sets that we would like to exist, we realized that some don't exist yet. And there are some data sets that require further processing to be more user-friendly. And when you are making a guide for someone who is siting recharge projects, pointing them to all the different maps that require different levels of expertise to use, we're hoping to we're documenting these gaps in the paper and hoping to document some of the further processing that would be needed. And there's one really big data gap, which is estimating the load of contamination in the subsurface that's there from past activities. One example that we tried to look into was legacy loading of pesticides in the subsurface. Pesticide use started being reported to DPR in the 90s, but a lot of pesticides were banned in the 70s and the 80s. And those pesticides are the ones that are showing up at above the MCL in groundwater still today. So there's a lot hanging out in the subsurface, and we don't have data on, we don't have application data from that. So difficult to estimate, but we were also thinking about what pesticides, we have pesticide use reporting data from the 90s on, how do we use it, what pesticides are most concerning from a MAR perspective, and that's just an example of one of the challenges that we are thinking of. We will try to address or outline methods for addressing it in the future. And also we are going to be summarizing a lot of the ongoing research and how it will influence our decision-making going forward. And so a few preliminary takeaways. We covered a lot of this, but the subsurface can attenuate some contaminants and be a source of others, which is complicated. Some systems are highly complicated, some are relatively simple, and the more complicated the system is, the more difficult it will be to monitor those impacts. At the end of the day, MAR represents a change to the overall system, and as Emily showed, establishing baseline is difficult. Yeah, there's a lot of variation. Yeah, and so establishing baseline will be difficult, especially in a complicated system. But the more you change the system, the more potential impact. And so sometimes when you're thinking about ways to avoid risk, it might sound like, oh, we put 1 inch of water everywhere, and then we won't have a big water quality problem. But then we want a big impact. We want a big positive impact. We want more water with better quality. And so, yeah, I came to this work thinking a lot about risk, and I left thinking about, or I'm still in it, I'm still very much in it, and I'm thinking a lot about ways to maximize positive impacts instead of ways to minimize risk. Yeah. So the next steps, we will be finalizing the paper and then putting together a preliminary map. And yeah, please stay tuned and find me if you are interested in this map and talking about the processing needed to put a lot of data sources in one more user-friendly place. And yeah, I think, yeah, we have time for questions. And I just want to give a really big thank you to the steering committee, Aisha Massel from Sustainable Conservation, Stephen Springhorn, Jenny Marr, and Osmar Macias from DWR, and Lisa Butler from Stantec too. They all, their guidance during this process was very appreciated. And these are all TAC members as well. And Erica Haight is, yeah. The gang's all here, okay.
Great, yes, so please, I see hands already. I think there's move around. Yep.
Here we
Do you
come.
have some too, or?
These first.
Okay, these first.
I only have
Got
some
it.
if we get awkwardly silent.
Ladies first, Jason. My question is, I'm curious, so SESCON already has the groundwater recharge assessment tool, and I'm curious if this water quality piece can just be layered into that or layered into other recharge assessment tools as something that can be additive as opposed to having to do a separate analysis and then overlap them afterwards.
Yes. Yes, we are working on that, and we do hope to include more layers in GRAT to add water quality considerations to it.
There are a couple questions in the middle. Who had their hand up? Right here.
Yeah, really interesting talks, which have spurred a lot of questions in my own head. And the question I have for the panel, as well as maybe everyone in this room, is I'm thinking about the complexities of trying to measure and model groundwater systems, and particularly the geochemistry that Scott/Peter was talking about. And it strikes me that there are some parallels between that and our ability to measure and model something like mass movements. And the way that we've dealt with mass movements, debris flows, landslides, and things is we don't currently, and I don't think we're ever going to get there, we're not going to ever have enough information to fully understand, say, during a given storm, when and where a landslide is going to occur. But we understand the science well enough to understand rules of thumb that allow us to either institute engineering standards to try to avoid those concerns, don't oversteepen a slope, et cetera, don't put drain water along a rock interface on dip slope, blah, 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 blah. And we've also come up with strategies to address them during emergencies. So we know that there are certain thresholds above which you can expect to see a lot more landslides start happening in terms of like antecedent moisture or rainfall intensity. So it strikes me that there might be parallels here with the water quality aspects where we can spend as much time as we want trying to measure and model a really overly complicated system that we will probably never have enough information to fully understand. But I'm wondering how close the community is to understanding what those rules of thumb or metrics are, so that we don't have to worry ourselves so much with the modeling, the discrete modeling. We can measure inputs and outputs of a system and know that if we cross a certain threshold for an input or an output, that we need to stop diverting or we need to turn off the water supply because we need to let the big storm pass and this arsenic flush to come out. And then once that flush is done, then we know we can start using that water. Those kinds of rules of thumb, are we even close to that?
I think we do have some rules of thumb as far as if you start with really good, clean water, that's probably going to be a good thing. Another good rule of thumb is that, well, human activity has created a lot of the contamination that we see in groundwater, and as we saw, natural flooding also creates groundwater changes, and the more you recharge, the more you're going to create a change. Sorry, I'm getting a little lost here. But I think we do have some general rules of thumb, but one thing that we talked a lot, we thought that we have good places and bad places to do recharge, but we realized that anywhere that doesn't panic when it rains, you could probably find a way to do recharge that would be safe. Yeah, when I say that, I mean like a landfill that doesn't want to flood or, yeah.
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of quick things on that. One, I think when we were talking about Sarah's presentation beforehand, I think one of the more profound things she had on her last slide is that this idea that the bigger the perturbation the MAR project is to the existing system, the bigger the question mark is. If you're only adding a little bit more water compared to how much you normally recharge, like Sarah was just saying, then that's probably a fairly small perturbation. So that's kind of a first cut rule of thumb. And then I think there are these bigger picture sort of even geochemical rules of thumb, changing redox conditions and so on, that you can think about. I will though say, and I haven't put it up in the next big idea thing, just my own bias, in defense of sort of explicit models, although we just talked about all the complexity, there's an incredible amount known about what controls these processes. And if you look at the data Emily talked about, there's an incredible amount known about the chemistry of the groundwater quality existing. And with new computational methods that are faster because of machine learning and so on, the prospect of having relatively user-friendly and pretty explicit groundwater quality scenario modeling is not like a cuckoo idea. It would take some time and investment, but I think it's a very plausible thing to be done. So.
Question over here, but I'm going to ask one first because I don't ever get to do that. And it really follows on what was being just talked about, is this question of like, we're coming more and more to terms of the fact that it's very rare that groundwater is entirely safe to use, whether it's a geochemical problem, it's microplastics, it's legacy contaminants. More and more places are going to wellhead treatment. And does that then diminish how much we care about the water that's being recharged because everybody's treating it as it comes back out again anyway?
No. A lot of things that are in groundwater there aren't even tests for. So like different pesticides and different degradates, we don't even have an analysis to see what the concentration would be. And there's treatment, I mean, treatment at the wellhead is great, and that is the answer for a family, but not the answer for the aquifer as a whole. Treatment's really expensive too, so you can make groundwater so bad that you can't even use it for agriculture. Like there's situations in arid climates like New Mexico where like the mine tailings resulted in all this leaching that created this arsenic issue, and we're not New Mexico, so that's not as big of a concern, but there have been issues when you put water where it doesn't go, so you do need to think about it because you can't treat everything.
I would also say that public supply systems are treating their water, and that's great, but what about the domestic wells? So for the most part, domestic well users, which are, tend to be disadvantaged communities or others that we're most interested in protecting, they're not treating their water. They don't have a way to treat their water. It's too expensive. So yes, for those people in particular, we want to keep the water quality as clean as possible, but also understanding that there is always going to be risk, and it's kind of how much of an acceptable amount is there.
I feel like this kind of touches on the past question about good rules of thumb. A really good rule of thumb, if you're considering to conduct a recharge project near a community, is to make sure that you're meeting with that community regularly and you're sharing all the information about the project, what the risks and benefits might be, what happens if risks do happen, if those are actualized, whether the mitigation practices that that community can expect. So making sure that you have full buy-in from any potential impacted households, communities, before you start doing it.
And I'll just have one very quick thing, which is, although I totally agree with the idea of, as Kaya said, precautionary principles for impacting groundwater quality negatively, I think it's very far from a foregone conclusion that a lot of recharge means worse water quality. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. So I don't think we have to throw up our hands and say, oh, it's just going to get bad. And I think we could probably improve it if we're smart about it. So.
No, well, I took you out of the queue. You're next.
This question is largely for Emily. Really interesting data set. So based on your precipitation event analysis for each constituent, there's 4 M members that can go up, up, down, down, up, down, down, up. So I'm curious if it would be possible to take the 35,000 wells, look at a couple key constituents, classify those N members, into N member states, and then start to slice and dice the data with some of those other covariables that you mentioned to start to try to understand like really dominant trends based on those covariables, region, depth, that kind of thing, and that could be used to inform, some of the other things that the panel just talked about, like areas that have maybe a high risk or something else. And then also just more broadly, like, are there other analyses that you're hoping to do with that data? It's very powerful.
Yeah, so that's a very great suggestion, and I will attempt to bring that to life. However, the examples that I showed have a lot of data, which made the pattern recognition much simpler. Unfortunately, the majority of wells that we're seeing in California only have 1, maybe 2 analyses during these events. And so that's part of the reason why a baseline consideration is really necessary, so we can say, oh, well, it went up, even if it's just this one analysis, it went up by 10 micrograms per liter, which is a huge amount. So that is something that we have taken into consideration. And again, these were public supply wells, which are significantly deeper. You don't normally expect to see recharge signatures from these deep public supply wells. Surprisingly, we did, theoretically. And then, so our other option for wells with a lot of data are monitoring wells. And that kind of works as well because they tend to be in contaminant-heavy areas for a reason, and so we can tend to track those a little bit better. The one thing that actually matters to most people are domestic wells, and we unfortunately don't have very many analyses from those, and it would be lovely if we could get some.
I wonder if some of that recharge signature that you're seeing is actually just like the compression in the system, like and Graham can probably talk better about this than me. Where's Graham? But you add that water to the top, and it's pushing water down. Yeah, so it's it's water that's been sitting there. So it's a question of like what water are you actually sampling? Is it the recharge water or water that's being mobilized because of your recharge water? Where's Graham? Graham, talk about this. I'm a surface water hydrologist.
Yeah, we definitely get the vertical gradients going on for sure. It could also be recharge water that's just going down the casing itself and not from the aquifer. I didn't really look into the confined areas as much as I probably should have for this presentation, but there's, again, a lot of factors go into what these patterns are showing, and we can only, at this moment, guess. These need a lot more study.
I was just going to mention from the comment in the gentleman in the blue here of talking about, instead of getting into the detailed geophysical modeling and that geochemical modeling, there's a great example of the State Water Board that was mentioned yesterday in their urban stormwater infiltration policy, where they look at kind of like where are general rules of thumb risk-based, so don't infiltrate in industrial properties and that kind of thing. So there's an example there. I don't know how it translates to FloodMar, which is a little more complicated.
Hi, thanks for all this work. And, as we talked about yesterday, we're kind of gearing up an effort to really clarify the actual regulatory pathway. So having this kind of work that establishes, what is the state of the information and what are the best practices without a regulatory hammer on it is really, really good. And I think the more information we can get about how these systems work, then the boards can react appropriately for a regulatory framework. One of the things that I'd like to put out there is, kind of these rules of thumb and these common sense things. We don't want to have to study each and every one of these to death. And you're doing a good job of. I feel like I'm really looking forward to this tool. And I think the first thing I'm hoping that we can address as the regulator is what are the ones that we shouldn't be worried about at all. And if we can kind of scrape those off and identify those and not put any very few barriers in place. Maybe there's some monitoring requirements, but you guys have any thoughts about what those rules of thumb might be to kind of get those ones that we really don't want to hold up? And that's kind of our I'm hoping our low-hanging fruit, and then dealing with places that do have risk, that's a whole nother conversation.
I think one thing we've talked about a lot is when diverting to avoid flooding, that there are a lot of places like a dairy lagoon that it would be much worse for the dairy lagoon to flood than it would be to divert water so that it doesn't flood. And so that there are times when that in an emergency situation, you're not going to be sitting there picking the very best field. And also that maybe there's a volume per area, which I won't say a number right now, but yeah, if you're only applying a certain percentage of the total that's being applied through precipitation and irrigation, then there's certain times when, if 6 feet of water is falling on a place and you put a half foot, why you wouldn't really expect to create a huge impact if there's like a ton happening already. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just say plus one to that. This idea back to the percentage of the perturbation. So if you're looking, personal opinion, if you're looking for a cut of things, if you're looking for a cut of things to not worry about, it would be these things that are sort of de minimis perturbations to how much water is already going into the system. It's a 10% increase or 20% increase. It's probably not that big of a thing versus we're not infiltrating any water here because of the way it's irrigated or so on. It's suddenly now we're infiltrating a lot. Well, that's a bigger perturbation, and therefore the questions are more complicated. So.
Hi, good morning. Karandev Singh. I'm with the Watershed Studies team. So my perspective is really at-scale recharge. And I did not take any water quality classes back in school, so I'm really out of my league here asking this question. But my question is really, so the capacity of MAR to move the needle, right? So I was looking at some of the numbers for, the San Joaquin Basin area, that's where we focus on. The natural recharge is to the tune of about 2 million acre feet. You do like a MAR 90-20 type recharge across the landscape, that number is about 100,000 acre feet on average, so about 5% more. So MAR is just adding maybe 5% in volume terms to the amount of recharge that's naturally occurring. So my question is, does that quantity really have the capacity to move the needle on water quality for better or for worse? Because we tackle this question of water quality, and to go back to the question, there's someone recommending maybe put that as another layer of consideration using the mapping you guys are doing in terms of where to recharge. And I think I heard both sides of the coin there. It was like, it's better to dissolve those plumes at times. At times it's better to not touch those plumes and recharge around them. But looking at the volumes, I'm just wondering, is MAR really going to move the needle for better or for worse if it's, 5% of the naturally occurring recharge?
I think something to consider when thinking about that question is, at least I'm thinking about like the domestic wells. They're much more shallow. So I imagine that MAR could truly impact their groundwater quality. Yeah, I think that there's a big chance I would defer to Peter and Sarah to maybe see how big that chance would be, but there would be impacts to domestic wells definitely with managed aquifer recharge.
Yeah, I would just say some version of the same thing, which is I understand the sort of global change argument, but the fact is people deal with specific water quality from specific wells. And so things that happen near those specific wells can be very impactful for what comes out of that well. Even if you did take the global valley average, it didn't change. That's not the functional important value. So I think that's where we get into the complexity of it all.
And that value you gave, I assume it's for like all the recharge that happened in the basin, but I think it's important to look at it in 2D in a way, like what fell on this piece versus what was added to this piece, instead of like, oh, we only added this much more. It's about the location of where it was added. So it might be 50% of the precipitation that landed on that piece, but it's only 1% of the total in the basin, but that's still going to have a big effect on the wells that are pooling from that area.
And then real quick, it's also matters what the source water quality is going to be. So your precipitation is going to be generally cleaner than anything that you would pull from a river. So by recharging with MAR from a river, you are essentially concentrating more constituents in that one location, which could therefore affect domestic wells or anything else.
That's the end of this panel. I don't know if you want to wrap it up, facilitator, or I can do it.
Sure, I'll just say thank you very much. We're getting the wrap-up signal. We're around. We're all very interested in talking about this. We're happy to talk more with anybody who's interested. So
let's give them a round of applause.